Well, it's just gone 9 a.m. here at the World Bank headquarters in Washington. And so, welcome to all of you tuning in from around the world to the first of the Parliamentary Network's meetings as part of these annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank here in Washington. There's perhaps never been a more important time for us as parliamentarians to get together to look at just the sheer complexity of challenges that we now have ahead of us. We frame this by calling it the challenge of food, fragility, and finance. We now have a situation where up to 1 billion people on this planet are now face a situation of extreme hunger, many at crisis or famine level. We have now got about 3.1 billion people who simply do not have the money in order to afford a healthy diet. And we now have an extraordinary 11 million people each and every day who are dying because they cannot afford a healthy diet. So on top of that, we not only have citizens who are without food, we have governments that are without finance. We have something like 41 countries now around the world that are on the brink of debt distress. And although prices have come down for food and fuel a little bit more recently, the truth is that many countries around the world are facing doubling or even tripling in some cases the level of prices. So this is a perfect storm that means that the world's poorest are frankly now dying at a rate that they shouldn't be. So we need the global community to act. We've seen over the last 4 or 5 months, both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund step up quickly. Last week, we saw the IMF introduce its new food emergency financing window. That will provide some important support for balance of payments crises that many countries are now confronting. And we've also seen something like $30 billion worth of World Bank funding made available over the next 15 months. So we can see multilateral organizations beginning to step up, put in place good measures in order to ameliorate this crisis. But the truth is that richer countries around the world still need to be doing far, far more. In fact, some estimates that I've seen from Oxfam, for example, show that we could have something like a $14 billion financing gap each year. So what we want to do in the Parliamentary Network is a couple of things this week. We want to shine a spotlight on the policy areas that are in immediate crisis. We've picked 2 topics for our work this week. One is today's session, which is on the food crisis. And then tomorrow we shine the spotlight on climate action and climate finance, where we have got some good news to report. We've got some new funding coming online. But here again, we now have parliamentarians who are at the sharp end of seasons that are changing. And really serious negative impacts on economies around the world. So the need for the world to do more is acute, but that's tomorrow's session. So we've got a great session to kick us off here on Monday morning at the World Bank. We're going to hear first from the World Bank Group, and then I'm delighted that we're going to be able to bring in some colleagues from the IMF. We then have one of our parliamentarians who's going to join us from Italy. And we're now moving back to in-person meetings, but slowly. So I'm absolutely delighted that we have got some of our parliamentarians from our key country chapters around the world in the room with me. And I'm going to pick on them in an unsuspecting way over the course of this meeting, just in order to make sure that over the course of the time that we've got together, we put together perspectives from around the world so that none of us are in any doubt about the sheer force of this crisis that is now hurting the people that we were elected to serve. So without further ado, Holger, I'm going to, Holger Cray is the Practice Manager for Agriculture and Food Security at the World Bank Group. And if I may, Holger, I'm going to turn the floor over to you for our kickoff remarks.
Liam, thank you very much. Also from my side on this Monday morning. And dear members of the network, as Liam said, there could not be a more urgent time to discuss this matter. If we are concerned these days that the impacts of the Ukraine crisis, and before that, the impact of the COVID crisis, and before that, perhaps the impact of other crises, such as locust outbreaks, also compromise the availability of food around the world, then I fear we're just looking at magnifiers of something that is much bigger, and that is the impact of climate change on the global food system. My name is Holger Cray, the Practice Manager for Agriculture, Food Security for Eastern and Southern Africa. And in the geography where I work, whereas in the past we would see weather-induced food security crises about every 12 and a half years. We now see them every 2.5 years. And that, by any standard, is too frequent for countries to recover, for regions to recover, or for farms to recover. So we're really facing a long-term challenge, and I'm very pleased to speak to the members of the parliamentary network because you have a tremendously important role in shaping policies. As part of my address to you, I want to quickly outline a couple of priority actions that are tremendously important to address. I want to highlight to you why a sheer focus on the farm is not good enough, because the food system has become very global and extremely complex. And I will outline to you a recommended course of action then that, combined with good news, is being funded by the World Bank Group now with an increased allocation. Let me start with priority actions. It is very clear that under these circumstances, 3 to 4 important steps have to be taken. The first is protecting the livelihood of vulnerable communities. Liam has been outlining that in certain countries and certain localities, the situation is really becoming extremely dire. And it is not only a productive response. It's not only a response of producing more food or shipping more food. It's particularly the affordability of food in many localities. So social safety net systems and getting existing food stocks to the most needy people is tremendously important. We saw in the disruption caused by the COVID crisis, for instance, that in certain countries there was enough food on the farm, but it didn't get to the cities. This was disruption. Therefore, a focus not only on producing more, on fertilizing more, on putting more seed into the ground, but a focus on social safety net systems and getting existing food stocks to the ground. We often use the 3 Fs, food, fuel, and feed, quite often forgotten. 2/3 of the rural livelihoods in the world are livestock-based. And these, thanks to the very unfortunate effect of climate change, are also hurting. So let us use not only food and fuel, but food, fuel, and feed when we help protect vulnerable communities. Second, very important role for the parliaments of this world, addressing system inefficiencies. Globally, governments spent an estimated $635 billion on agriculture subsidies. But most of these focus on a limited set of crops. They do not yet focus enough on enhancing the resilience of the food system. Resilience defined as the ability to recover after the impact of a shock. And I'm very happy to discuss this in greater depth during the discussion. But remember, $636 billion currently spent on agriculture subsidies with questionable impact, I have to say, on climate resilience in the system. And third, maintain trade flows. Trade flows, do not block borders, do not embark on export bans or restrictions to trade, because that leads to situations spiraling out of control. And I'm very pleased to see that, particularly in the geography where I work, in certain countries such as Zambia, a breadbasket country in southern and eastern Africa, has very clearly said in the current crisis, our borders are open and they will stay open as long as the current administration is in place. So let me highlight to you now what it is that needs to be done in an increasingly globalizing food system. I said, let's have more than a focus, a wider focus than just a focus on the farm. Actually, when we discuss about food system nowadays, then the farm is only a relatively small segment of it. Think of the whole commercial sector downstream. And it's not only processing, it's the whole commercial sector around farming. The provision of services, the provision of capital, the provision of seed, of feed, of fertilizer, all these are job multipliers in the rural space. And if Liam introduced at the very beginning that food is becoming unaffordable, then this is also a function of jobs and of income in the rural space. It is actually the food system that provides most of the new jobs in the rural areas of our client countries. If quite often you will see people argue that as a country develops, the role of agriculture and food will decline. This is just wrong. That even in the world's most advanced industrial economies, take the European Union, take Northern America, it's usually agriculture, food and beverages as an industry that stands there sector number 2, or at least sector number 3 in terms of income, of job creation, and of innovation. So a multi-layered system. And if we accept that this is a multi-layered system, then of course our interventions need to be multi-layered. A sheer focus on rebuilding resilient agriculture production capacity is important, but it is not enough. Many of the shocks nowadays are being transmitted through the natural resource, soil, water, and in an increasing number of countries, biodiversity collapse. So this is an intervention area that is so important. Natural resource policy as part of food policy to prevent shocks from being transmitted in the natural resource domain. The market domain, a lot of the shocks transmitted by the Ukraine war to economies around the world are not transmitted through the productive circuit, not through the natural resource circuit, but actually through the market circuit. So helping with regional market information, market facilitation, logistics, logistics hubs, better flow of goods is a tremendously important investment area for food supply. Again, it's not only the farm, not only natural resources, not only markets only, but fourth, and I already alluded to that, also improved sector support policy, greater focus on resilience and national and regional policymaking. As my time is coming to an end, I'm very pleased to announce to you that the World Bank has been ramping up the funding for all these 4 areas that I just outlined over the past couple of months. $30 billion commitment in my area of responsibility in Southern Eastern Africa and on the African continent at large, a $3 billion food systems resilience program has been approved by the board, available to member countries right away for key investments in these very important areas. Again, the key elements of it, a clear focus on the wider food system beyond just the farm, and a longer range focus on resilience, since we might be tempted to think that it's smaller, currently acute crises that hinder access to food and rural incomes. But I allege, and I close with this, it is actually the very, very dramatic acceleration and escalation of the consequences of climate change on the global food system. I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
To hear you again, you gave us a brilliant presentation earlier in the year. Since when, as you set out this morning, about $30 billion extra has now come online from the World Bank. I think, just if I can just push on 2 very quick questions. So of that 30 billion, about 19 billion is attached to projects that basically had undispersed funding. So I guess projects that were agreed, but the money hadn't begun flowing yet. 30 billion over 15 months is a lot to get out the door. And so I suppose the question for parliamentarians is, what do we do together with our governments in order to expedite the projects that might need that money? And then how do we make sure that the projects are in the right place and all the good stuff like good governance, transparency, local impact is well attended to? What are your kind of views on those kind of 2 questions?
Quick responses to this. First, if you allude to a certain part of that already existing in sitting projects, then I encourage everybody to embark on extremely flexible strategies. Let parliaments articulate the clear demand that existing projects be quickly restructured, quickly flexibilized. We are quite often very, very open to this, but we need to hear the demand. We can only act on restructuring or flexibilizing of projects that were created 4 or 5 years ago and now need a different emphasis. We can only act if we hear articulated demand, a clear request for it. We're not an organization that unilaterally one morning decides to restructure, change the direction of a project. Secondly, and this is even more important, there is a lot of new commitments to this. It is new commitments that are not only voluminous in financial terms, but also quite new in as much as the time range for which they will be made available is much longer than for your classical project. What is a classical project? 3 to 4 to 5 years of intervention time frame. But we recognize that the food resilience intervention is not a matter of 3, 4, 5 years. It is therefore that this allocation in Africa has been made for a 7-year term so that governments can actually plan and embark on strategies that perhaps also important for parliamentarians and for governments at large, go far beyond a single electoral cycle. So to have more continuity in these resilience policies. But also there, we need to hear clear demand. And I hope that as we go into the annual meetings, as we see heads of delegations meeting the World Bank's vice presidents and senior leadership, that there will be a clear articulation of demand for food systems resilience in the change of an escalating and accelerating climate change. I think this is one of the greatest challenges we as the development community and perhaps as humanity have been facing so far.
Great. Okay, good. Well, I've got some very demanding people sitting with me in the room here at the World Bank who I'm going to bring in once we've heard from Michelle from the International Monetary Fund. Thanks so much indeed for joining us from across the road at the IMF. You two have made some pretty big announcements in the last week. So the food shock window is obviously very welcome. I don't think we've seen a number attached to that yet. I guess that will depend on how things pan out over the next year. But why don't you give me the fund's perspective on what the fund is doing, what you need rich countries to do, and what you'd like to see parliamentarians do more of over the 12 months to come.
Liam, thank you very much, and thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking to you. My name is Michele Ruta. I am the Deputy Chief in the Strategy and Policy Review Department, and I'm in charge of trade and trade policy. So not surprisingly, my focus is going to be specifically on that angle. And the main message that I have is in the title of these few slides that I put together, which is that open trade is key to food security. And in this brief presentation, I'd like to put this into perspective and highlight some actions that are needed. So let me start from a longer term perspective. If we look at what happens in food markets, we see that there's been quite a bit of instability in the past 20 years. In the chart here, you see food prices over time, and in particular, prices of cereals. And as you can see, there have been 3 crises. The first one in 2008, 2009, the second one in 2012, 13, and then finally, we have the most recent one that started in 2020. In all these cases, what happened is a mismatch between global demand and global supply of food. Simply put, there is not enough supply of food globally to meet the global demand, and this pushes prices up. And obviously, the question is why is this happening? Now, in the current context, we all know that a big factor is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Here, what we see is that looking at trade data in 2019, Russia and Ukraine are very important exporters of agricultural products. Just as an example, jointly, Russia and Ukraine used to export 25% of world export. So this was a big shock to a quarter of world export that happened suddenly. Second, Russia in particular is a large exporter of fertilizers and energy products. These are key because these are inputs in the production of food. So this was a primary cause of the latest surge in price that we observed, but definitely not the only one. Climate change, as Holger mentioned, is a big reason why prices in food markets became so volatile. It's the extreme weather events that are associated to climate change. Other factors as well, such as the pandemic, also contributed. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a big factor, but together with other factors that have been there for some time as well and are likely to remain. Another factor that I would like to stress is uncooperative trade policies. Uncooperative trade policies, simply put, made a bad situation much worse. What you see here is data from the World Bank and the Global Trade Alert, and they report export restrictions imposed on food and import liberalizing reforms. And as you can see, after February 24th, after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the number of both export restrictions and import liberalizing measures went up a lot. Let me say something about export restrictions, why they are a big concern. They're a big concern because the goal of these policies is to increase the domestic supply of food. The way they do this is simply by taking off supply from global markets. By doing so, they magnify the shock and so push prices even higher. Not only because prices are going higher, other countries are tempted to do exactly the same thing. So it is a little bit like where you are in a stadium and everyone is sitting down to watch the game, then one person stands up to see better, and then the persons behind start getting up as well because they want to see better. In a short amount of time, you see that everyone will be standing up, being more uncomfortable, and they'll watch the game exactly in the same way as they were when they were sitting down. Now, import liberalizing reforms can also be a problem, not in general terms. Generally, as economists, we see liberalizing import as a good thing. The problem is that when countries have high import restrictions on food, perhaps to support farmers, and then temporarily move them down, that again contributes to instability in global food markets. And I can come back to this point later. Let me also say that this data arrived up to June. After that, we have seen both a decline in prices, in food prices, and a decline in this in export restrictions. So the situation has improved, but we need to remember that prices are at historically high levels. And because of this, we are always in a precarious situations. And it's possible that protectionism and cooperative trade policies will come up again. We saw recently a new measure imposed by India in the, on rice. Now, this is just to give you a sense of why these measures matter and why they are a concern. Here we are focusing on wheat, which is obviously a key staple and one that has been particularly hit by the current crisis. And we are focusing here on export bans, so a subset of export restrictions. And here what you see is how much the export bans accounted for in the global export market. And again, this is between January and July. Export bans reduced global export supply by 21%. And these affected prices globally, pushing them up by 9%. So the impact of these measures in destabilizing food markets is very, very relevant. And incidentally, this is not just something that we observe now. In the food crisis of 2012, we had the same impact In the case of wheat, some estimates put it at 30%. So the fact that countries restricted exports and then other uncooperative trade policies increased wheat prices by over 30%. So not the first time that this happens and a continuing concern. Now, why do we care? This is probably obvious to all of you, but it's just to restate some comments that came up earlier. First, this is a big terms of trade shock for food importing countries that leads to balance of payments concerns. This is a concern per se, but it's particularly worrisome because many of the countries that are net food importers, and that's what you see in these figures, are low-income countries. So these are the countries that have less space in their fiscal systems to react to a food crisis. Second, so first, the most vulnerable countries are the ones that are more prone to crisis. Second, within countries, the most vulnerable people are the ones that are most affected. Why is that so? Well, richer households generally spend 20% of their income on food. Poor households spend over 50% of their income on food. When food prices go up, are the most vulnerable people, the poorer people, that are most negatively affected. These concerns are not just macro concerns. They lead to they can lead to malnutrition. There is also impact on health, impact on education, and therefore it's not just the risk is not just a short-term crisis, but a longer-term crisis because it affects the development pattern of these countries. So what can be done about that? There are four sets of issues. The first is to support households that are most vulnerable to food security. Second, limit uncooperative trade policies. I can come back on this actually in the Q&A. In the context of the WTO Ministerial Conference, there was good progress, excluding export restrictions exports to the World Food Program, so for humanitarian reasons. That was a very positive step, but just a first step. A lot more should be done. Third, boost food production. As I said from the beginning, the problem is a mismatch between demand and supply. Global supply is not sufficient. That means that global production needs to increase. And fourth, invest in climate resilient agriculture. As climate change continues to disrupt weather patterns, we need to be sure that food systems are more resilient. Now, my last concluding point is that for all these things, trade, open trade is critical. It's obviously critical for the first point. Vulnerable households need to access food, and very often food is produced in other countries, so they need trade. It's obvious for the second point because limiting uncooperative trade policies is about keeping trade open. It's essential for boosting production. In order to boost production of food, for instance, you need the key inputs, you need the fertilizers. If restrictions on exports are imposed on fertilizers, it is much more difficult to produce more food globally. And finally, open trade is also important to promote a more climate resilient agriculture, because again, technologies that are needed are not produced in every country, they are produced in a handful of countries, and they need to be traded internationally. So thank you very much again for listening. And if you want to reach out, here are my contacts, and looking forward to the Q&A. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much indeed for laying that out so nice and clearly. We're now going to do a brief tour of the planet and just sort of begin getting some of the perspectives from parliamentarians on the table before we come back to you with some of the questions that arise. But Julia, could I come to you first? In a way, you're at the sharp end of this because you chair the important group, the Panel on Trade and Investment for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. I mean, you'll know that many of us in Europe are now really focused on the war in Ukraine and the consequences of that. I sometimes have to, probably like you, remind my colleagues in Europe that there is a planet outside Europe as well that is now confronting some really serious problems because of what's going on in Europe, and that creates responsibilities and obligations on richer countries to step up and do more. But why don't you give us your perspective on the challenge, and then we'll come to some of our colleagues in the room for some more evidence from the sharp end. Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Liam, for giving to me the floor. And it's a pleasure, of course, for me to be here, even if in a hybrid format. But yeah, there's a planet outside, and of course, this planet is influenced by the war in Ukraine, by the Russian aggression. Why? Because, as Michele Ruta was saying, both Russia and Ukraine were central suppliers for cereals and fertilizers and also CO2. Let's not forget also the CO2. And in addition to this, there's unprecedented drought, especially in the Mediterranean region and in Africa and in the Gulf, global warming and other extreme weather phenomena. Plus, in addition to that, there's a growing public debt, energy crisis, and inflation. And we'll go back to inflation in a minute. And these represent some of the main international issues that, according to the recently established UN Crisis Response Group, can result in a threefold crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Before the war, like Michele Ruta was pointing out, Ukrainian wheat accounted for 10% of global exports. However, with the destruction and ongoing pillaging of Ukrainian cereal perpetrated by the Russian forces, which can also be tantamount to war crimes under the relevant international convention, Ukraine is no longer capable of ensuring the same amount of supply. Secondly, the war is also playing a key role in raising energy prices worldwide. And this, together with the disruption of the global value chains caused also by the COVID-19 crisis, are the main causes for the high level of inflation. According to IMF's latest forecast, global growth expectations are down to 3.2%, while the FAO Food Price Index is at near record levels at 7.9%. Low growth estimates, combined with a high level of inflation, will have a significant impact in reducing the purchase power of most fragile sector of our economies. And here we go back, for example, to one of the points of what can be done, said by the previous speaker, which is support households vulnerable to food insecurity. Consequently, it is likely that food supplies will be diverted in technological advanced countries, where households will be able to sustain the price levels. We must therefore ensure to promote free trade and refrain from any form of protectionist measure, which could further disrupt the global food supply chain, as clearly indicated during the WTO 12th Ministerial Conference, which PAM recently attended. PAM has continued to monitor the still ongoing looting and pillaging activities perpetrated by the Russian forces in Ukraine and their devastating impacts on global food supply chains, Nonetheless, PAM has welcomed the international community's efforts that resulted in the Black Grain Initiative, which has partially eased the global food distress. In the longer term, however, rebuilding and reinforcing the supply chains will require an unprecedented multilateral effort aimed at undertaking a profound transformation of the current food systems into more sustainable and resilient ones in the framework of the One Health approach and of the advancement, of course, of the SDGs. And we go back to another point of what can be done, expressed by the previous speaker: invest in climate resilience agriculture. This emerged clearly at the recent UN Food System Summit, recently held within the UNGA, but also during the FAO Special Committee's meeting, where PAM also actively participated. Addressing the global food insecurity will remain a major concern for our Assembly, especially in the light of the dramatic repercussions and consequences it will have on all countries of the Euro-Mediterranean and Gulf regions. In this context, I'm happy to announce that PAM will hold the first ever Euro-Mediterranean and Gulf Economic Forum on the 7th and 8th December in Marrakesh, kindly hosted by the Parliament of Morocco. And this will be one of the topics that will be addressed during the so-called Davos of the Mediterranean. The forum will represent a major opportunity to address the global implications and innovative regional solutions to the current food crisis, to which the World Bank and the IMF Parliamentary Forum are already significantly contributing, and where I therefore look forward to deepening today's discussion with you all. Thank you for listening. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And you reinforced a few of the points actually that were made by our colleagues from the bank and the fund, which was useful to hear. Now, we've got a really strong delegation from Ghana with us all week, actually, and we've got a good group of the delegation here at the World Bank with me. Can I come to colleagues from Ghana, because I think in many ways you're an exemplar of all of the things that are coming together and hitting countries in food crisis. So you've obviously got some real budget difficulties after COVID. There was some expensive programs there. You import a lot of wheat. You've got food prices that are gone up, but you've also got fuel costs as well that are impacting on the ability to transport fuel. Just tell us a bit about how you see things in Ghana, what's going on, what the political challenges are, and what is the kind of help that you think is needed to make a difference. Kwaku, do you want to kick us off as the chair of the newly launched Ghana chapter? Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Kwaku Kwati. I'm the chairman for the Finance Committee of Ghana's Parliament, and I'm also the chair for our newly launched parliamentary network, the country branch. Actually, Liam has taken the wind out of my sail. The last point you made just before you put the question to me, in my view, summarizes the situation in many developing economies. First, COVID imposed fiscal pressures. Revenues underperformed because economic activity came to halt. At the same time, there were unplanned expenditures that many of these weak economies had to take on board, plus the urgency of COVID itself created an atmosphere in which wastage, in my view, easily went up. The overall effect was that COVID left many of these countries with macroeconomic instability. Now, central banks had to intervene. And that had meant that local currencies have weakened. And if you're already a net importer of food, with the weakening of your local currency, food becomes very expensive. And with it, as you rightly indicated, fuel cost goes up, so that supply food chains domestically also become expensive. A number of these points are the case for Ghana. So we have our CD coming under quite some pressure, with the result that fuel prices have been going up. With it, food prices have been going up. What could be done? I think we, especially as parliamentarians, should continue with the advocacy to get the richer countries and our development partners provide the kind of support that in these difficult times would at least give us some breathing space to begin to think of those strategies that would make our economies more resilient in the longer run. But I think whilst we do the advocacy for better external treatment of our situations, domestically, we should be doing the things that came up in the first discussion, namely the little that we have. Are we able to review the priorities, the support in food supply? Where they have been applied historically, is it not a good time to begin to review and to see if we can have some efficiencies at home? Yeah. And that, of course, goes back to us as parliamentarians. And I think in the case of Ghana, what we can do is, especially when our budget is coming up, to look critically at the food-related interventions and expenditures by government, and to see whether we cannot do it with a more critical eye by way of efficiency gains in these difficult times than we probably have done in the past. These would be some observations.
Yeah, fantastic, great. Cassiel, Collins, do you want to come in and add, help us round out that picture for Ghana?
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. To start with, I think it is obvious that sanctions on Russia export, obviously emanating from the aggression on Ukraine, is having a devastating effect on global food crisis and energy costs. In fact, if you look at world inflation, it's really going up to levels that in recent past we've not seen. The key question has to do with which part of the world is having the devastating impact most, and where are we seeing the impact affecting livelihood. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, you can see clearly that inflation is really going up. In the Northern Africa in particular, you see the impact clearly. If I take my country, for instance, year to date, food inflation is 122%. And 122% food inflation year to date, 10 months down the line. The impact is largely on the ordinary Ghanaian. I mean, so the poor person is becoming poorer, and the middle class is falling to the poor levels. And the impact obviously will mean that a lot more disposable income is being used for the purposes of financing their food. That isn't strong enough, and it obviously has impact. But I'm more interested in what is actually triggering this inflation on food. Ghana does not consume much of wheat, particularly coming from Russia or Ukraine. But obviously we rely on some amount of fertilizer coming from Russia in particular. So if the fertilizer is coming in, is it the cost of fertilizer that is actually leading to this food inflation, or what is actually leading to this food inflation? My conclusion has to do with the fact that the Ghanaian currency is weakening by the day. And obviously, because we actually import so much, and if you import and your currency is weakening, the prices are certainly going to go up. And that is what is actually driving this. On the other hand, the government has invested quite some amount in the last 5 years on a program called Planting for Food and Jobs. So you plant for food and jobs and you test the resilience of the policy during difficult times like this. And you notice that import is still going up. So it comes back to the first speaker's question that globally, the world is spending $636 billion on food subsidy. But the issue is what is the impact on this subsidy? Are we not subsidizing a bit too much, or we are subsidizing too little? I think I've always said that subsidies coming from advanced countries is having some devastating impact on some developing countries as well. We rely on poultry and obviously rice from other countries. If you are to be a poultry farmer locally, you cannot compete the poultry coming into your economy because the imported poultry is cheaper than the poultry you actually produce locally. So that is being subsidized, and the local economy is not able to support that kind of subsidy. So obviously, it is not worthwhile engaging poultry locally. You have to rely on import. Is this something that we have to have a look at it again? And what can developing economies also do to subsidize, working with the World Bank, to be able to be competitive to those subsidies that are having devastating impact on your local economy? I think that's the big question that I'm more interested in.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's a great set of issues. Collins, do you want to just finish the job here? We've got a pretty good analysis now.
Yes. And I think we started the discussion this morning during the breakfast, and my senior colleagues have touched on a few things. I think we have a situation in Ghana where goods or foodstuffs in the capital, Accra, is very, very expensive. But when you get to Kumasi or other places, the prices are cheaper. And you speak to people in Accra and they tell you that the cost of transporting the goods from one particular section to the other is what is causing this particular inflation, especially within Accra. You have a situation where you go to supermarkets where 70% of all the products are imported. And so a little shock elsewhere affects us in Ghana. I think locally, in spite of the solution that have been preferred by my senior colleagues about the bigger economies as supporting the IMF, the World Bank, supporting economies like ours, I think internally we need to find a mechanism of moving away from this dependency of whatever we eat from outside. I think we should find a way of industrializing, and that is why I'm happy when our government initiated the one district, one factory policy. Of course, you know, this kind of policy have gestation period. It takes time for you to really, really enjoy and feel the effect of it. But I think these are policies that must be implemented in order to take us away from the dependency of whatever we want to eat, we have to import. So anytime there's a shake, and my colleague talked about fertilizers, we buy fertilizers from Russia. And so there's some turbulence in Russia and it has its rippling effect on all of us. We need to focus our attention on developing our local capacities so that in times like this, we can stand on our feet. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Great. Steve, I wonder if we could come to Nigeria now. I mean, just could you give us a bit of a sense of how this crisis is hitting people in Nigeria and how the Nigerian government's responding? I mean, it's the figures look really stark when you look at the figures of people in Nigeria who are now facing food crisis.
Well, my name is Honorable Steve Azaiki. I'm Member of Parliament from Nigeria. I serve on about 7 of the committees, appropriation, agriculture, education, and so on and so forth, science and technology. This discussion is apt and is very important for Africa specifically. But I see the crisis and the problems in Africa, especially in Nigeria, I see it in 2 dimensions. One is the external factor, which I will attribute to the developed countries' trade patterns in terms of restrictions on quality, on quantity, so on preservation, and so on and so forth. I think that externally, the developed countries and the World Bank, the IMF, if we want to encourage Africa to produce, they also have to produce for export. And to do that, knowing our condition, our peculiar case in terms of technology and so on and so forth, the end users need to encourage them by providing some of these. In fact, if we are even talking of support to Africa, we have to look at how this product can be moved, can be exported. Because if we don't export, it will not encourage even the farmers to go into big time farming. Then internally, most African leaders still don't understand that the war in Ukraine is serious and is affecting global economy. They just see this as something happening very far away. Because if you know that this is serious, we should by now, look at how best to support ourselves and come up with strategy that we can be self-sufficient or at least provide for our team population. Nigeria has more than a population of 200 million people, but when you look at the percentage of farmers, is mostly subsistence farming that's still going on in Nigeria. Then for us in the National Assembly, we've always asked the federal government to provide budgetary fund for research. I like what we are talking about, agriculture, climate resilient agriculture. And this is what we should be looking at. We can't just be producing food like we used to do. We have to take the climate change into consideration when we are thinking of agriculture back in Africa. Then one of the things that I see that is not helping Africa is that the African regional countries, for example, West Africa, where my colleagues from Ghana come from, we need to have interparliamentary discussion on this. We say we are West African countries and there is free trade, movement of humans and goods. But this in reality is not true. We've not been able to, if we know where Africa has, where Ghana has a competitive advantage, say in production of citrus, then Nigeria maybe cassava and yam and so on. So why don't we discuss these issues? And even if it's trade by barter, after all, Russia, China, and India is going to think of that. So because the pressure of the dollar on the local currency is so high that if we are to pay for goods, if it continues like this, especially in Nigeria, where the dollar has moved from 36 naira to $1, from 36 to $1 is now 78 to $1, which is double. So it's not possible for us to even import foods again. And so the regional countries, we need to begin to think of how we can trade within ourselves and actually put to work this movement of goods and humans. Then I also think that we must think of, in fact, in Parliament, we are now saying that we should budget, because Nigeria in particular, one of our problems is electricity. How do you have a poultry in rural areas when you don't have electricity? So we must come up with a policy of providing solar to these communities, and this is where the World Bank, I think that the World Bank and the donor agencies should should look at the rural communities, how we can sustain, because what is happening in Africa and Nigeria is the same thing with what is happening in Ghana. Everybody is moving into the cities and the rural areas empty. In fact, I have a very sad experience that I went to a totally riverine community. When I was growing up, if you go to those communities, even women can dash you fish. Today I went there. These are rural villages surrounded by water. Yet the only thing they have to eat is beef. It was sad, because all the young people who are supposed to go fishing, they've all moved to the cities doing nothing. So you have so much unemployment in the cities, while in the villages, there's nothing. So if we can encourage movement of people back to the villages by provide minimum basic, this is so that they can set up basic industries or become entrepreneurs in their communities. So in summary, I want to say that the situation in Africa is critical. It's critical because the leaders themselves seem not to realize that the situation is very, very difficult. And as members of parliament, we need to look at advocacy and information dissemination on also changing mindsets on important, because when I was growing up in Nigeria, rice basically in the villages, we eat it only on Sundays. You know, it was seen as something special, but we had everything. You know, today, unfortunately, I don't know the situation in Ghana. Rice is the mainstay of the economy, and we don't produce rice. You know, even the rice that are produced locally are not appreciated. So we need to find a way to come up with policies, advocacy, also information, mindset changes, and so on and so on. But government must come up with a policy to make sure that people appreciate what is produced in their own country. Thank you.
Excellent. That's brilliant, Steve. Thank you. And then finally, in this round, Nima, we began talking as the second newest chair of a parliamentary chapter. We began talking, I remember, in Tanzania about some of the campaigns that you were running on nutrition and stunting in particular. So it'd be useful to bring that into the conversation, but just more generally, give us the sense of your perspective on the food crisis in Tanzania.
Thank you. And I believe my colleagues will join me in saying this is a very great opportunity for having us parliamentarians from Global South to have the access to such engagements, such global events, so that we can also bring our voices, the voices of the communities that we lead at the global level. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Very quickly, in general, I think when we're talking about the food supply chains, we need to recognize that in most of our countries, there's a difference between rural supply chains, rural food supply chains, and urban food supply chains. And most of the time we focus on the urban food supply chains without realizing that the rural food supply chains are the ones that feed the urban food supply chains. And so what happens is you find the smallholder farmers who are in the rural, they're focused on selling everything to the urban areas, and they themselves end up being food insecure. So the household food poverty is increased because of the focus on the urban food supply chain. So I think also when we're trying to look at food poverty, we need to find ways in which, whilst we're strengthening the urban food supply chain, but also it shouldn't be to the detriment of the rural food supply chain. So that was the first thing. Second thing is most of our African countries are highly dependent on importation of food, which is very unfortunate because we have arable land, we have the workforce, we're able to produce our own food. But what happens is we almost have a vicious circle in the sense that we export raw and then we import back finished food products. So if we're talking about safeguarding food supply chains, maybe we need to come up with interventions and solutions that will empower and enable us to get into food processing so that we don't export fully raw and re-import back. And that also makes us lose because when you're exporting raw, you're also exporting jobs. And then you're not getting enough foreign currency as you would have if you had exported an almost finished product. Then the third item is oftentimes we tend to not look at the issues of inputs. When we're doing agriculture, inputs are very important. So this is where issues of seeds come into play. Again, in most of our countries, we're highly dependent on imported seeds. And that is why even some of our countries during COVID, we were hit in terms of the harvesting, not because we had issues in the continent, but because we were dependent on seeds that are being that we're importing. And when there was lockdown, shipments were not coming through. It means we're not getting the seeds on time, we're not getting the fertilizer on time, we're not getting pesticides. So also it's important to look at issues of inputs, not just to look at the food once it's been harvested, but what about the inputs? And alongside this, our smallholder farmers need to be, I heard my colleagues talking about, Africa to also export food, but we have a challenge on how we manage the inputs, because oftentimes you find that, for example, our horticulture produce isn't able to be exported, for example, into the EU because of high chemical residue. So there is a need to also, and those are all of things along the entire supply chain. And at the same time, when we're looking at the supply chain, we need to also look at the food safety. You often find that supply chains for food produce that is being exported, they would follow the international standards. But supply chain of food produce that is being eaten locally isn't necessarily tailored to those same strict international standards. For example, chemical residues. I can ask my colleagues here, when we go to a local food market, do they check the chemical residues of the horticulture? Probably not, but they do check it for when it's export. So we need to make sure there's a balance of these, because it's safeguarding food supply chains. So safeguarding should be both for local consumption and for international consumption. Now, finally, going back to the point that we're discussing in Tanzania, oftentimes when we're talking about food supply chain, food security, we tend to find, okay, we have food, so we are food secure and it ends there. But we tend to forget nutrition security. Food security does not mean nutrition security. For example, in Tanzania, the regions that are the food baskets, Southern Highland regions produce over 60 to 70% of the food in Tanzania, but they're the same regions with the highest level of malnutrition. So that there goes to show that food security doesn't mean nutrition security. And most of the time you find, even with, if it's World Bank funded projects or IMF funded projects, it will focus on food security, not nutrition. So when there is a need, maybe the nutrition component is a need of a country, how can you structure it in to these World Bank funded projects when the focus is food security and not necessarily nutrition? So a country like Tanzania, we're the third country in Africa with the highest number of stunted children. And I come from a region called Kagera, which hosts the highest number of stunted children in Tanzania. But when you go there aren't any donor-funded projects for malnutrition. But you find there are food security-related projects in other regions. So there's almost kind of a mismatch. And I think this is where also as parliamentarians, we can play a role. I was very pleased to hear Holger speaking that there's an opportunity for making arguments or tailored statements when you want to maybe change the focus of World Bank projects, etc. But then I ask myself a question: we as parliamentarians, if we want to do that advocacy with our government, through the Ministry of Finance, how do you go about it? And how can you even go about it when you don't even know what projects are there? So it's like we're kind of already at a disadvantage. Like, I personally would like to find out what World Bank projects are there that potentially could accommodate the issue of nutrition. But when we're not aware, how do you start up that discussion? And then once you're aware, how do you then also start up that discussion as a parliamentarian? And this is why, we're very grateful for the opportunity of having the PN national chapters. And we're hoping through that, maybe we can be capacitated to know how to engage and have these critical conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Kwaku, did that provoke further thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think my colleagues have spoken quite eloquently to the matters, and thank you very much. But listening around the table, I think there's something that ought to be pushed up the priority consideration list. at the heart of the food supply inadequacies we're having in many developing economies, Ghana included, is macroeconomic instability. And as I indicated earlier, COVID exacted its own impact, and then we have those global uncertainties all fueling or worsening the situation. I think there ought to be a deliberate strategy to deal in the short term, with a kind of macroeconomic instability driving many of the food supply inadequacies on the ground, and in fact risking the stability of some of those democracies. I clearly see that if things really continue as they're doing for a considerable period, it might degenerate into disturbing many of the democracies in which we're already having these difficulties. So it's important that we bring forward the need for an urgent response to the macroeconomic instability we are seeing across many of these countries. Ghana, in our case, has invited the IMF or have come to the IMF for a program. I think even in the administration of these traditional remedies to macroeconomic instability, in the administration itself must respond creatively to this new development, that traditional processes and requirements would have to be reviewed in the light of the urgency of the macroeconomic instability we are seeing. So I don't disagree with Collins at all, that ultimately the solution is building food economies that are resilient, but there's a real risk that unless the current wave of macroeconomic instability fueling food crisis in many of these economies are responded to frontally, we may get all these economies suffer consequences that will take a long time to heal.
Liam, can I make?
Yeah, please.
Let me make a quick suggestion on this matter. I think as a network, parliamentary networks, and observing what is happening in our countries, I would firmly recommend that. So I think it's about time the World Bank in particular start funding food security in various countries that are suffering. Evidence shows clearly that the reason why food inflation is becoming a problem in sub-Saharan Africa is largely because of the dependence of basic food requirements in those countries. Clearly, it cannot continue, and it shows that obviously we do not have the strength to stop Russia from its aggression, and the more it continues, the more the ordinary people suffers. People that obviously had no input in what is happening are paying the brunt of what is happening globally. And the sanctions that are coming, obviously, because of the European Union and the West imposing sanctions, we have no control, but it's hitting us. So what can the World Bank in particular do to support countries that are suffering the devastating effect of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine? Yeah. Let's
bring a few of these points back to our speakers. And if you're watching from around the world, if you've got comments and questions, please just put them in the chat. I've got a few questions from the Philippines and elsewhere that I'm going to come to after this round. But let me just come back to our colleagues from the World Bank and the IMF, because what's emerged from this discussion is about 7 or 8 key points. So first, it's not just about food security, it's about nutrition security. Second, we've got to make sure that the right aid is actually in the right places. There's got to be a spatial dimension to this, which is important. We've then got a set of more kind of microeconomic issues which we need to work through. So how do we make sure, Helga, to your point, that we have got domestic development of a climate resilient food, beverage, agriculture sector that that allows us to escape from this scenario that we're in at the moment, where we're exporting raw and we're importing finished, as Nima puts it. There's then a set of trade questions. The fact that there are domestic subsidies to foreign food businesses, which are therefore undercutting domestic businesses. There's this very interesting point about regional cooperation, particularly given some of the challenges with the dollar, and important points about exports and fair trade. So there's a bunch of kind of industrial development questions that go alongside this, and then how is that funded, both through the domestic subsidies that are available, but also through new World Bank and IMF programs that are coming on stream. And then there is a set of macro and monetary issues. So how do we make sure that things like the food shock window can provide some stability where countries have got balance of payments problems? But then I'd be interested in your views on the challenge of devaluation as well, where you've got countries that have had to take quite significant monetary policy interventions and have now got declining currency values. What is the support that can be provided there? And then how, as parliamentarians, do we bring a level of transparency and focus to this, particularly when we have got significant new funds coming on stream? Helga, maybe I could sort of start with you and then come to the IMF.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for extremely inspiring.
You're a bit faint. Sorry, I don't know.
Interventions. Yes. So let me speak up a little.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. That's the IT. So I just extended a vote of thanks for very inspiring contributions, and let me take them in reverse order and then address some of the key points. I first want to thank Madam Representative from Tanzania for the intervention. See, quite often the term food security is used loosely, but please be reassured that when we at the World Bank and most of my colleagues use the term, we of course think about nutritional security. And actually, without making it too complex, but the matters that I discussed, for instance, the subsidization regimes and the focus on too small a number of destinations for subsidies and nutritional diversity are closely interlinked. Remember the number that I mentioned, 650 billion US dollars subsidy equivalent. These actually go into 7 crops worldwide. And you see countries that only focus on one particular crop with all their subsidization regimes, very prevalent in Southeastern Africa without mentioning individual countries. So the moment you widen up the focus of support, the moment you focus on productive diversity, you also foster nutritional diversity. And Madam, I couldn't agree more. The ultimate objective is nutritional accomplishment and not just a basic caloric accomplishment. At the same time, I really want to congratulate Tanzania. I'm just back from Dar es Salaam and from Dodoma. I do consider Tanzania to have devised for herself a particularly modern agriculture strategy, the Agriculture Sector Development Plan #2, which has all the elements of what I called for in my earlier intervention: a focus on productivity, of course, but a focus on the natural resource basis, a focus on commercialization, and all this on a base level of good policy and institutional thinking. And it is actually, I don't want to spill the beans too far, but we are in a very advanced conversation with the Honorable Hussein Basha, the Minister of Agriculture, on a couple of areas that will meaningfully respond to your call for an increased focus on seeds, on inputs, but also the exportable goods. On exportable goods, just one quick word. I don't think that there's anything wrong with a focus on exportable goods in agriculture development in Africa. I would highlight the example of Rwanda here. Rwanda has devised for herself an agriculture strategy where very clearly the country says our export markets for the future are the cities of the continent. The cities with an increasing number of middle-class clients who would like to see products with added characteristics, value addition, but also labeling, reliability, greenness. And I find this focus so particularly suiting it. I think a development strategy for many African food systems that first and foremost focuses on overseas might not actually be a strategy for the moment. And Madam Representative highlighted this. On the contribution by the honorable representative from Nigeria, just one very quick response. You addressed what I summarize as the demise of the rural space. And I invite all of us to reframe a little the thinking around the rural space in the broader sub-region. Quite often there is a narrative, and Honorable, I don't allege that you had this in your narrative, I'm broadening out, of countries still being locked into smallholderism, small farms, low yields, and so on and so forth. What we see in more contemporary data, particularly over the past 10 years, is actually a good news story. We didn't have a lot of good news stories in today's conversation. But see, we do see the growth of a medium-sized farm in many, many countries. Tanzania, Ghana, Zambia stand out as countries in which locals, so Ghanaians investing into Ghanaian medium-sized farms now try to supply urban markets and regional markets. These are farms somewhere between 1 hectare and 200 hectares. These are farms that employ, and smallholders don't do that. These are farms that invest into capital goods. These are farms that procure services. And because of all that, they create, in Tanzania, for instance, let me just quote that number, 13 million wage labor days every single year. That is a massive job engine. And I think it is not that much the demise of the rural space. It is a changing face of agriculture. And if we understand that well, then it also has consequences for the future of sector support. It's not any longer a support that predominantly focuses on smallholderism. I'm not saying to neglect it, but I'm saying the key growth and the key job growth and the key resolution to some of the food security question actually lies in a new demography of the rural space. I find that completely fascinating, and that is where most of the jobs for the future are being created. On the discussion from Ghana, see, on fertilizer, we're in a crisis. The continent is right now in a crisis on fertilizer availability, and that is first and foremost also because, unfortunately, the continent has relatively little domestic fertilizer production capacity. It's all an imported commodity, as you rightly alluded to. We predict that the fertilizer crisis, if I may call it like that, may lead to about 10% lesser fertilizer use by farmers across the continent compared to other years. And we see 3 bigger groups of countries in terms of their impact on food security. Unfortunately, there is a base level of countries that already before the crisis have used extremely small amounts of fertilizer. The price effect there will be minimal, and so we will not see a massive reduction of food production in the country as a function of price increases. The second set of countries, curiously, are countries in which the fertilizer use has been increasing in the past couple of years, and where countries have devised quite ambitious input support programs, farm input support programs, affordable input support programs. Every country names it a little differently. What we expect in these countries is to see relatively little impact on the farmer, because governments buffer off the prices, but unfortunately a quite significant budgetary impact, which I'd be happy to discuss separately. And then a third set of countries where we might actually see, these are countries with already decent uses of fertilizer, but no expressive input support schemes, where we now see fertilizer being diverted away from staple and food commodities more to cash crops and exportables. Regional cooperation here will be tremendously important. We quite often discuss country by country interventions, but the program that I outlined earlier, the Food Systems Resilience Program, also explicitly focuses on regional collaboration. And this is for a number of reasons that we all easily understand, that regional coordination and cooperation integration makes sense. It is also because in the food system, a lot of the challenges faced by the food system are regional, transboundary in nature, transboundary watersheds, weather is transboundary, animal diseases are transboundary, and so on and so forth. And third, because see, not every country needs to conduct the full investment into the full suite of services. Like if there are, for instance, reference laboratories, meteorological stations, and so on and so forth.
Holger, let me draw you to a close there, just because
yes.
At the time is against us, and I just want to bring in the IMF, and then I've got another very quick fire round of questions. But that's a fantastic set of responses. Thank you, Michaela. Just very quickly, if you can.
Yes, let me thank you also the various members of parliament that intervened. It was extremely interesting. Maybe just to be brief, let me link to what the members of parliament of Ghana mentioned. There is a short-term and a long-term problem. And on both, international organizations need to step up. Let me focus more on the short-term problems. As the member of parliament of Ghana mentioned, there is a concerns with the balance of payments. The food crisis is also a terms of trade shock, which simply means that for some countries, the price of imports increase a lot, while the price of exports do not. And this can lead to an imbalance. In practice, this means that their currency will depreciate, and by depreciating, it makes purchasing food even more difficult. So there is a sort of vicious circle that enters into place, and this requires intervention. The IMF had already started intervening. Several countries approached the IMF for assistance, both in the context of existing programs and asking for new programs. On top of that, just a few days ago, on September 30th, the board of the IMF approved a new food shock window, which is expressly targeted to help in the case of a food crisis. This is for countries that have either a rapid surge in food import prices or countries that have a systemic problem with their food system. So in these cases, countries can ask for emergency financing to the IMF. And this is already open. It will be operational for 1 year. And the type of intervention will depend, of course, on a country-by-country basis, and it's specific to address the balance of payments needs. Importantly, though, this is capped at 50% of the quota of the member countries, but it can accumulate with other emergency financing, and this cumulative number has been pushed up from 150% of the quota to 175%. So let me stop here. If there is time, there are other things that I would like to say about.
I just wanted to get the food shock window on the table, because that is incredibly helpful.
No, that's right, what I figured. If there are other questions on the trade side, I thought the comments on the subsidies and the regulatory cooperation side were also very important, but I leave it as I understand there is a time constraint.
Okay, great. Well, look, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, so I'm just going to, if I can, just do some very quick fire questions that have come in from around the world. So, colleague in the Philippines wants to know, how do we solve this challenge of our young people not wanting to go into the farming business? How do we make sure that we've got a supply of farmers for future generations? We've also got a question then about enhancing food supply chain efficiencies. How do we minimize food waste and support farmers? And then finally, how do we discourage countries from introducing these export bans that are having such a negative effect on food prices. So if Holger, Michaela, if you wouldn't mind just sort of giving us just like a minute and a half each on those questions, that would be super helpful. And then Guilia, I'm going to come to you to round up, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Liam. As I tried to allude to in my earlier intervention on the 13 million wage labor days in the food system every year, I do think that the food system itself is a fantastic career opportunity and will create better jobs for youth. Many of them off farm, however, and that perhaps would be a good theme for a conversation between us separately and with a little more detail. The focus on reducing food loss and waste is inbuilt into the newer generation of operations. It's actually, I dream of a day where each and every project has a component that helps reduce carbon footprint and actually mobilizes even funding from the carbon funds, international carbon funds, to our client countries. And also here, my team and myself stand available for any discussion this week at the annual meetings or beyond that. And let me yield my time here to Michaela.
Thanks. Maybe I'll take up the last questions that you mentioned, the one on the what should we do about export restrictions. As I mentioned in my intervention, there was a positive development at MC12, the ministerial conference of the WTO this summer. Exports to the World Food Programs have been excluded. This is extremely important, but it's not enough. New rules need to be negotiated in this area. I think the original rules of the GATT system were thought for country-specific shocks. Here, increasingly, because of climate change, we see global shocks. And when shocks are global, it means all countries face the same kind of problems, and the rules no longer work. So what we need to think is guardrails of the flexibilities that are currently in place. Examples would be pose limits to the number of months where export restrictions could be in place. Another example would be that export restrictions should be capped at 50% of exports of the previous 3 years. There are examples. The important thing is trying to devise some guardrails so that we avoid that uncooperative trade policies make things worse for food importers. Thanks.
Julia, let me come to you last now, just to give you the impossible task of reflecting on everything that you've heard. And bringing us up to the end of our session.
Actually, no, not about everything, but about the question on how do we push young people to work in agriculture, and about one observation from one of our African colleagues about urbanization. Well, there's an experience here in Italy in the Alps called University of the Mountains, where young people, thanks to competitive prices, competitive fees of the universities, thanks to a nice environment, thanks to low prices for housing in the area, they went to these universities and they learned how to do agriculture in an area, in a peripheral areas with less and less population. And now a new culture started of people living in the mountains and working in agriculture. So the answer is through culture. If being a farmer will become cool, for example, thanks to soft power, thanks to movies and so on, I think this would push young people to become farmers. Moreover, I'm witnessing this in Italy, but in other industrialized countries, there's a mega trend that is pushing us towards communities. After the big mega trends of national states and markets, now what the item, the third pillar, let's call it like Raghuram Rajan, Professor Raghuram Rajan, are the communities. It means that, for example, we are shortening the supply chains of food. In my area, I live in Milan, for example, there were no more farms, but now I go to the farmer to buy my milk, for example. It means that some people went back to do these jobs. This was just a simple example. So this is it. Thank you, Liam.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, as ever, the clock is against us, and that brings us to the end of our first session. But I hope you agree this has been a fantastic kickoff to our annual meetings week. We've started by gripping the issue that is top of the list for many of us around the world. And I think what has emerged from this are 5 key questions for parliamentarians as we work with our domestic governments and as we build a much deeper and more transparent relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. So the first question is obviously, have we got the policy framework right? Have we got a policy framework that is focused not just on food security, and are we delivering the right help, not just in the right countries, but the right places within countries? Second, there's obviously a big question about whether government has got the right strategy for the domestic food system, farms, but as a whole food business. Are the investments being made in transition to climate resilient agriculture? Are we maximising the value capture inside the country, exporting that value for others to capture? Are we creating jobs through the strategies that we've got, and particularly for young people? And therefore, have we got the subsidies that are being in the right way to support that? Then a third set of questions about trade policy for richer countries. And the way in which they are potentially subsidizing unfair competition in developing countries. There's then a big question about balance of payments support. And I suspect that question is going to become more and more important over the course of the next few months. And then finally, I didn't want to lose this point about the pressure that needs to come onto richer countries, because even though it is true there aren't limits or sanctions on food exports from Russia or Ukraine, there absolutely is pressure on fuel costs, and that is having an impact too. So asking richer countries to do more is going to be an important part of the argument that many of us are going to need to have when we get home. Now, we know that the IMF is beginning to strike its first deals around the Resilience and Growth Trust. That is potentially up to $40 billion. Much of that money will go into climate finance, but I think what this discussion has revealed is that it's pretty difficult to separate questions of policy in climate finance from improving the food supply situation over the years ahead. So I think there's a set of questions for our IMF colleagues about how they're getting that program design at country level in a way that supports some of the challenges that we've talked about here. And then there is the 30 billion that the World Bank has made available, both the 19 billion of existing plan plus the 15 billion of extra. So there are resources that are coming on stream over the next year and a half. We've now got, I think, quite a useful set of questions for parliamentarians to be asking both their finance ministries and their governments and their central banks about whether they're getting the program design right. So, folks, that's been a brilliant kickoff for the week. I'm already exhausted, and there's still another 3 or 4 days to go. So we're gonna wrap it up here before we have our parliamentarians roundtable. So it just leaves me to thank our speakers who have joined us in the room, but also our speakers from the IMF and the World Bank. Giulio, great to see you. I'm hoping to see you again at some of the PAM conferences that we've got coming up.
Of course.
But for now,
thank you for having me.
Have a good rest of the day. Bye. And join us tomorrow, same time tomorrow, for Climate Finance. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.